Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 25th of July. Today we're going to be doing a full front update, starting out with the north and working our way to the south. Before I begin, I want to say that from now on I'm going to be using these red arrows to indicate Russian movements and blue arrows to indicate Ukrainian movements, just to clear up any confusion. And I'm going to try using in the future colors that are more, they contrast more with the background. So I know that the colors that I just showed were sort of dark, and so is the background. So I'm going to try to work around that. But for now, this will do. Let's get into the update. So around Liman Parashi, the Russians advance a bit to the south, at most 3.4 miles, even less. And they took over some of these forested areas just to the south of the town, approaching the town of Serhiivka, which is a major Ukrainian defensive node on the front line, which is holding up the Russian advance from reaching the suburbs of Kupyansk a bit to the south around Petropavlivka and the eastern side of the city of Kupyansk itself. And this comes after the Russians secured the Molchanove rail station and the forested areas to the west of it. In this area, there were these Ukrainian DRG units that for months were harassing the Russian line and making it very hard for Russia to advance. And in recent months, the Russians have been trying to clear it out. But as things stand right now, after my adjustments to the map, the Ukrainians do still hold positions in the southern part of this forest adjacent to the Oskil River, and they are utilizing that as a defensive position to hold back the Russians for as long as possible. So even after the Russians launch these attacks, it's clear that the Russians are on an offensive footing in this area. It's very difficult to secure any sort of major breakthrough in these areas because before an offensive even begins, when you begin to send in the men, and there's not that many, but when you begin to send in the men to penetrate the line and break through towards a certain target or town, the Ukrainians, they usually know about it beforehand. In the immediate buildup, they're able to prepare and send in the reinforcements. So just an example from today, the Ukrainians, they moved in units from the 20th Motorized Infantry Battalion following the Russian attacks to the south of the Monpershi. And that's part of the reason why the Ukrainians have been successful so far at holding the Russians at bay and preventing them from entering the town of Serhiivka itself. There's also reinforcements from the 3rd Tank Brigade, and there's also artillery that's being moved not on the eastern side of the Oskil River, but towards towns such as Zaporizhzhia and Kupyansk more broadly. And in that area, the Ukrainians have moved in 2 artillery batteries, so that's around 12 howitzers that are being moved in now to try to prevent the Russians from achieving more breakthroughs and from pushing the Ukrainians out to wear down their manpower and offensive capacity. And so for now, the situation is not really critical for the Ukrainians. Going a bit to the south, this is where it gets very interesting because on the 24th of June, the Ukrainian forces, they retreated from the town of Serhiivka. This is something that we talked about in the last video, the possibility that the Russians would flank the town of Serhiivka because of their positions to the south of the town and their positions across the Zaporizhzhia River. It did create the possibility for a cauldron to be formed in the Ukrainian forces, and there are not many that are within Serhiivka, but whatever garrison there wasn't there, it would not be able to defend the flanks. They were simply no match for the Russian artillery, and they were most likely outnumbered as well. So they moved a bit to the west to Nadia, and Nadia is a very, very small town. It's just one road, a couple of houses, and a forest adjacent to it. That's probably what's going to be most contested, that forest. And it does look difficult for the current Ukrainian forward garrison to hold on to it until further reinforcements arrive. So we're going to have to see if the Russians, once they finish clearing out Serhiivka, if they're going to push towards Nadia. But in terms of the rest of the bridgehead that was established, that we talked about in previous video, their situation is still the same. So Novogorivka is still contested. There's no breakthroughs yet. But just to really focus on the elevation for a second, in regards to Rahorodka, I want to show the local topography. So if you don't know, this is the Zaporizhzhia River over here. It's flowing in blue. And then the town of Serhiivka is generally around here, it's on lower elevation, but parts of it are also extending into this local ridge, which I've marked over here, like that. And so the Russians, once they actually enter this area, because they've not entered it yet, they will be in control of some favorable heights. Currently, the Russians are contesting the Novogerivka Valley. And so the front line looks a bit like this over here in this valley area, where the color is very green or light blue. So that red line is generally what's being contested at the moment. So the Russians, they're trying to establish control of the heights to the north of this contested valley. And that would be over here. That would be in this area over here. They do not control this part yet. This is still under Ukrainian control. But with the fall of Serhiivka, if the Russians continue to capitalize on the Ukrainian withdrawals and continue putting pressure, what you can see is the Russians pushing past Serhiivka. Nadia also is on a pretty low elevation. Nadia is around here. But if the Russians continue pushing to the south of Serhiivka, to this area over here, they will be in control of a ridge that is on the same elevation as the major Ukrainian ridge that we talked about in yesterday's video. That is a great observation point and vantage point for the Ukrainian forces to give them a local domination over the entire Zaporizhzhia axis. So they'll be on equal footing, about 600 feet above sea level, maybe even more in some cases, and it would overlook the area that's currently being contested, which is Novogerivka. So that's the significance of all that. Now, the Ukrainians are aware of this threat and they are moving in reinforcements. A lot of those reinforcements would include units such as this Omega Special Forces Anti-Terrorism Detachment, which is a unit from the National Guard. It was previously stationed, I believe, around Zaporizhzhia, so it might have been moved recently in order to hold the line in this area. And then you also have this unit called the 1st Separate Special Purpose Brigade. I think that's also associated with the National Guard. If I'm wrong, I might be wrong about that. But it's also another one of these units that's been moved to the Svatove area to sort of contain the bridgehead and prevent a major breakthrough from spilling over into Kharkiv Oblast and towards the Oskil River. And the Ukrainians, not only around this bridgehead, but also a bit to the south around this town over here on the Torsky ledge, around Terny, Yampolivka, Torske, they're also moving in reinforcements to prevent any sort of Russian attacks and to attack their positions, the Russian positions. They are moving in M119 howitzers. These are 105 millimeter guns to the outskirts of these towns like Torske. And presumably that will be fired towards an area like Kremina. But here's the issue. If these guns are stationed in a place like Torske, which, by the way, is extremely close to the front line, so if you're going to move in these howitzers so close, then there's a big threat that the Russians will be sending in their own drones and the Ukrainians will not have enough time to down them, and then they might be able to hit some of these howitzers. But nonetheless, even if you stationed it that close to the front line, look at the distance between Torske and Kremina. The guns that we're talking about in this case, these 119 howitzers, they have a maximum range of 11 miles, which is equivalent to 18 kilometers. So if it was 11 miles, best case scenario, it reaches the western outskirts of Kremina, and most of the Russian extremely fortified positions are a bit to the east of that, to the east of the town itself, actually. Should use red for that. And that means that even though it could hit a place like Dibrova, Kuzhmye, some of these fort positions, it will not be able to hit the main Russian rear and supply points that are in Kremina. So that does show the significance of Russia's advances that were conducted around Kremina to the east of Kremina over the past 3 weeks. That really expanded Russia's zone of control by, you could say, 5 miles, maybe even more in some areas. And that created a massive buffer zone for the Russians against their main town that they're controlling in this region, Kremina. So that's good for the Russians. Now, moving to the south to the Bakhmut sector, where we do have some good news for the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have been able to advance into Klishchiivka from multiple different directions, starting off from the north. The northern heights, which we talked about before, where the Russians really did defend for very long time at point or height 215.7, for instance. That was one area where there was very heavy fighting, and the Ukrainians did send wave after wave of infantry in small groups to secure the trenches, but they were pushed back by Russian artillery. At this point, these heights are a gray zone. They are contested. You have both Russian and Ukrainian forces in this area, and no one side could really utilize the heights in that area to their advantage. This is not that bad of a situation for the Ukrainians because they have control of all these other heights to the west. So they don't really need control of these northern heights. Of course, they'd want to have control of the northern flank, but it's way more important for Russia to have control of this northern flank so they at least have some sort of high ground overlooking their positions in the Klishchiivka Valley. And now they don't really have access to that because of the contested nature of these fortifications. But what's even worse is that the Ukrainians have been able to solidly entrench themselves in all the forested areas to the west of Klishchiivka. You could see this on the map that the gray zone is to the east of these forests. The Ukrainians already have control of these forested areas, and you have small groups that are operating in these areas, and they're not being pushed out at the moment. And the thing that's going on as a result is that the Ukrainians have the ability now to enter the town of Klishchiivka from different directions, such as from the south, where you have this road over here. This is contested area at the moment, so I wouldn't say that Ukraine has any control over these houses, but you can see how close they really are to it. Distance of only a couple hundred feet. So a small group of infantry could get into these houses, entrench themselves, and make their way up and take over the entire road, for instance. And that's what they did in part of Klishchiivka, near the center. But most of the town is still under Russian control. Probably like 90% of it is under their control, especially the city center, not really city, but town center. And the Russians do have all of their units stationed in that area and just to the east of it. But what's also bad news is that the Ukrainians have been able to reach very, very close to Andriivka. They have further expanded their spearhead, this sort of push, this bulge that pushed through the Russian southern flank and their defenses over there. And they've, I would say, since the last video, advanced perhaps 1,000 feet. Maybe it's a bit more if you measure from here. Maybe it's like 0.3, 0.4 miles. And they are about to enter the town of Klishchiivka itself. Andriivka itself. And as we said in the last video, this would cut off one of several different road junctions, one of several different paths into Klishchiivka itself. This is the path that I'm referring to. But as you can see, there are different paths that the Ukrainians have to take still, that the Russians are currently utilizing. And those are still under Russian control. But this would just cut off one of them, and it would also give Ukrainians positions just to the south of Klishchiivka. And by the way, these positions are on a higher elevated area compared to Klishchiivka itself. So that is also a significant advantage for the Ukrainians if they take over Andriivka and they are approaching in that direction. The Ukrainians, they also advanced adjacent to the Donbass Canal, and they are pushing through some bush lines in this area, taking over local strong points. The goal would be to reach Kupyansk, or at least have attacks from the north, so then you could launch a simultaneous attack across the canal over here, and then it would be a two-pronged assault like that, and that would cut off another major Russian defensive node at the moment in Kupyansk, which is very close to the front line right now. But let's look at the elevation for a second to understand what's fully going on. So I don't want to be too repetitive with my explanation over here, so we're just going to look at what's new in terms of elevation. So the northern fortification is contested at the moment, as I said before, and the problem posed by this is that the Russians don't have control of this square area over here marked in red. That square area is one of the only heights around Klishchiivka that the Russians had control over. They could use as a forward vantage point to control the area and fire onto Ukrainian positions, provide defense for their own valley, which is over here, the Klishchiivka Valley over here, where most of their forces are stationed within that town. Then in terms of Ukraine penetrating into Klishchiivka, they are penetrating into areas that are on low elevation, so there's no really topography advantage from that. But you can see how the forests, which are split between a higher elevated area about 600, 700 feet above sea level, and the Klishchiivka Valley, which is about 400 feet above sea level, for instance. So you can see how these forests over here, the ones that I have marked with these red lines, those are being taken over. Those are not really the main hills that the Ukrainians even want to take over, but it is a good area for concealment. Then in terms of Andriivka, again, Russians still control the town itself, so they do have control of some of the surrounding heights. But then to the west of it, you could see there's also some pretty high elevated areas there as well that the Ukrainians now have control over, which will give them positions to the south of Klishchiivka that will be used to fire upon that and to fire upon the wider Bakhmut sector and some of the roads leading into Bakhmut from the south, for instance. As you can see over here, some of these roads that are leading into it, and some of the roads that are also leading into Klishchiivka itself. I've talked about this before, but just to stress this again, here are some of the roads, all of them going through this relatively low elevated area compared to the Ukrainian side. Now, something that people are going to ask me about is, why is the elevation so important? Why are you always talking about it? So, what I'm going to say to that, and I have a few points written down for why, is that even though I could acknowledge that some of the advantages that are gained by having control over a hill are sort of nullified by having access to smaller drones like FPV drones, which the Ukrainians and the Russians are both using, especially on the Zaporizhzhia sector, but also on this Klishchiivka sector. Nonetheless, there are still a lot of advantages to having control over heights. And some of these I should have mentioned earlier, but these are just some fundamentals. For instance, just having a line of sight. You have a better line of sight if you're in control of a higher elevated area. It gives you a good view of the entire battlefield, and it allows you to better coordinate movements within your unit and understand the movements of your enemy. So, in terms of the entire combat process, it allows you to find this early detection and allow for target acquisition. You gather intelligence, and could begin to identify natural barriers, natural obstacles that might be something that you would not be able to see if you are in a valley, for instance. If you're standing on a hill, you could see sort of the disruptions like rivers in certain areas, some of the open land that you don't want to pass through, minefields, stuff like that. That's why you want to have control of the elevation, for instance, on a small level. But then also the high ground, it provides a lot of cover and concealment, and this does this by creating, first of all, physical obstruction. That's pretty obvious, but it also does that by creating obstruction to enemy sensors, which makes it harder for drones and artillery to target your forces on those heights. It gives control of the local airspace, which makes it harder for the enemy's aircrafts and drones to freely roam around the airspace that is being contested above the front line. Also, it would increase the firing range deeper onto the enemy lines. So if you're using artillery and mortars, it's much better just based on projectile motion to fire them on a higher elevated area than a lower elevated area. It increases the depth into the enemy lines that you could fire into. And it also would allow for control of local domination of different key points, different key passes and choke points that are needed in order to secure certain parts of the battlefield. So, for instance, like a road junction, if you have control of heights, you could fire onto that and prevent your enemy from utilizing it and then go in and take it yourself. Or local natural barriers that you want to take over. And of course, this would be done by sometimes firing small arms fire, firing ATGMs, firing snipers from a whole a range of different weaponry. But all of that is better when you're using it on a higher elevated surface than a lower elevated surface. So while it's not the end of the world if you don't control the high ground, I do still think it is important and it does play a huge role. And that could sometimes be the deciding factor between one side doing well in a certain confrontation versus the other. Because sometimes these units, these assault groups from either side, the Russian and the Ukrainian side, they may be similar in terms of manpower or in terms of the amount of vehicles they have. Obviously, the artillery is different, but then again, in terms of elevation, that might be one of the areas where Ukraine can sort of salvage that and sort of close the gap. And that's something that they're trying to do over here in Klishchiivka. And of course, drones do still have an effect. And I will actually get to drones in a second. The Ukrainians are using a lot of drones in this sector, They are mainly being used by the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade Azov, and there are three key drone units within that unit that are playing a big role in providing cover for the Ukrainians to try to make up for the artillery overmatch that the Russians have in this area. And so the units responsible for that are the Hornet unit, the Terra unit, and the Kryla unit, those three. And they're mainly using the FPV drones. Obviously, they have other ones that they're using, like switchblades, but they much rather would prefer to use these very cheap FPV drones that they could buy in bulk and just quickly retrofit and utilize on a mass scale. Now, something the Russians have been doing, not just around Klishchiivka, but also around Zaporizhzhia, so this is also important for that sector, is that they've been utilizing their electronic warfare systems to try to disrupt the usage of Ukrainian precision guided munitions that are guided by GPS systems. And they're also trying to disrupt the radio communications of the Ukrainian forces, because you got to understand that these Ukrainian forces, they're acting in very small groups when they're entering Klishchiivka. They're entering in groups of 5 to 10, and it's very important that there be coordination between all of these men. They're not obviously going to be able to talk to each other by mouth, so they're going to need to utilize the radio signals. And a lot of the time, it's just not viable from long distances, maybe from very small distances, due to the Russian jamming of the radio waves. So, just as an example of that, for instance, one system that the Russians are utilizing is the Repellent 1, and that detects and suppresses these very small Ukrainian UAVs at distances of up to 19 miles or 30 kilometers. So let's just measure that from, let's say, over here, for a bit farther from the front line, but still close to Klishchiivka, and see how far of a range that has, because it could be significant. It could really reach until some of the areas very deep into the Ukrainian lines around places like Konstantinivka. So then you see why this is a significant development. And it's one of the things that Russia has been really investing in. And so have the Ukrainians, by the way. I don't want to take from their achievements in terms of electronic warfare, but in terms of the Russian side trying to defend against the Ukrainian FPVs, they've been really innovating in that regard, sending in a lot of systems. And the Ukrainians, they're alleging that they destroyed about 4 Russian electronic warfare systems over the past few weeks, but I don't know if the videos, there's enough video footage to verify that. Anyway, let's move on further to the south. Now, we haven't talked much about Zaporizhzhia because there haven't been many changes to the front line. But in terms of reinforcements, the Ukrainians are moving in the 148th Artillery Brigade, new unit, to the Zaporizhzhia front. This unit has not entered the front line yet, but it is in the process of reaching that area. And the Ukrainians are also moving in a lot of HIMARS MLRS systems. And the goal of that is to, first of all, establish counter battery fire to minimize the Russian advantage from their artillery, and also to hit key logistical hubs on the Russian rear. Here I have mapped, and I'm not going to go too into depth about this, but I have a lot of different rail lines mapped over here. And then Google Maps themselves, they have mapped all of the highways. And then I have mapped all of the different bridges that could, in theory, be hit. Some of them have been hit already, but as of now, they've been repaired because there haven't been issues within Zaporizhzhia itself and Kherson itself in regards to the rail transit. The issues in regards to the highways comes from the Kerch Bridge, but as of now, they have not caused any sort of significant damage to the logistics. You also have the issue of derailment. You have these Ukrainian partisans behind the front line that are derailing these rail lines, and you can't really guard every single inch of these rail lines. Are very, very expensive, but most of those usually get repaired. But it could really be a pinprick, and it could develop even further if it becomes an issue in terms of supplying a lot of cargo to the front line. So we're gonna have to see how the HIMARS fare with that, and whether they're able to take out some of these logistical hubs. You also have Storm Shadow missiles that the Ukrainians are using, and they're beginning to hit targets within Crimea. Multiple different targets have been hit in recent days within Crimea, including ammo depots. So this is a shift in the Ukrainian strategy, I'd say, because originally the Ukrainian strategy, and this is from 40 days ago, the Ukrainian strategy was these assaults. I don't know if they're company size, maybe a bit smaller, but they included assaults from larger than a squad, but you had infantry that was aided by these mechanized elements a lot of it being Western vehicles, not all of it. But they were trying to go through with these mechanized columns and break through at certain areas with speed. That was their goal. Unfortunately for the Ukrainians, they were not able to do that in the initial phases of the counteroffensive. And so it seems like what Ukraine is trying to do now is break through in certain areas with small groups. As I said before, in Klishchiivka, 5 to 10 men. It's probably what's going on in Robotyne as well. So the Ukrainians are assaulting with smaller groups, not as much support from these mechanized elements. They are still using vehicles in the capacity of allowing them to be moved closer to the front line. So they're going to go in some sort of infantry fighting vehicle, maybe a Bradley, which provides a lot of protection as they're out on the road in open fields. But then they get dismounted and then they get dropped off near the front line. And then from there, they go on and fight in these small groups. And the Ukrainians have been able to push the Russians out of this forested area to the northeast of Robotyne. And so that is a minor success for the Ukrainians. We're going to have to see if they take it over. This is a part of the process of gradually taking over the favorable positions to the east of Robotyne in order to allow an assault from the flanks to finally take over that town. Because the Ukrainians have been fighting so hard over the course of this counteroffensive to succeed in doing so. Now, final thing before I end the video is the Ukrainian strikes on the Odessa region. So on the night of the 23rd, going into the 24th, the Russians sent Geron-2 drones to hit different terminals that are on the Danube River, which is the river which really is the separating line between Ukraine and Romania, as you can see over here. The most significant strike was on the port of Reni, and you could see that most of the damage was aimed at oil refineries. The highest amount, I would say, was at the grain silos. The grain silos are located over here, and you also have some grain silos over here. There's also most likely weapons that were stored in this area that might have been another additional target that was hit. And there's also probably ammo depots. And then you also have the terminal itself, which is located over here, where all the vessels are mounted before they go out and transport the grain to the rest of the world. Now, this is really a testament to the accuracy of the Geron-2 drones, because this strike was really about 400 meters away from the border with Romania. It could have easily hit an area just to the west, because it would only be 0.2 miles away, and hit NATO territory, because Romania is in NATO. But nonetheless, this is really the first time that I've seen in recent history that the Russians have hit these terminals along the Danube River, and not just the one in Reni, also the one in Ismail over here. This is a commercial port as well that was hit with the drones yesterday, but most of it was at Reni. This is significant because we already knew about the bombardments on Odessa and Chornomorsk, where you had ports that had grain silos, of course, and then also had shipping infrastructure that was going to export all of the grain to the rest of the world, and that was important for Ukraine's economy and politically speaking. But then nobody really entertained the possibility that Russia would also hit the Danube route, which is another route that the Ukraine probably was looking towards, because a lot of their infrastructure on the ports around Odessa have been damaged. But now the Russians are taking this out in order to probably cause economic problems to Ukraine, and also to eliminate whatever sort of equipment is stationed over here, military equipment. But of course, the main goal is the grain silos. The Ukrainians reported significant damage to their storage over here. And again, this is all occurring at a time after the collapse of the grain deal. So it doesn't make sense that the Russians do want to cut off Ukraine's ability to be a grain exporter to the rest of the world. And that would also give the Russians more political leverage in the long term. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.